Hello and good morning. This is Daniel from Panagenda. Very sorry for the delay. We were actually waiting for some more people to join, and that happened right now. So we have a 5 to 6 minute delay. However, I think we are still going to make it in time. Welcome to Virtual Faster Better and how to virtualize the rich client and the browser plugin. May I give you a quick introduction? And before starting, I actually just recognized I'm probably not even showing my screen, so let's fix that real quick. And as of here, I guess everything should work just fine. My name is Daniel Reimann. I'm the Director of Technical Account Management here in the United States. I'm working with Notes and Domino for over 15 years at the moment, and ever since I joined Panagenda in 2011, I'm focusing on the IBM Notes Client Optimization and Infrastructure Analysis. I'm originally from Germany, living in Boston, Massachusetts at the moment. This is why you may recognize a funny accent or a lack of words at some point. Let me run through a quick agenda together with you so you know what you can expect from this webinar today. I'm going to tell you a bit about what we typically see and do at customers when we have a consulting engagement, as we are speaking about notes in virtual environments in this webinar, and that is something I want to emphasize again and again during this webinar. So basically every topic I'm focusing on is really related to nodes running in virtual environments. So we are speaking of nodes running in server environments like Citrix, that could be terminal server, or that might even be some VDI environment you might be using. And all the optimizations, the way of installations by means of the command lines you're going to see are all focused on how to deploy, install, and run nodes in these virtual environments. When it comes to effectively using nodes in these virtual environments, we will be speaking about the necessity of roaming. We're going to give you some best practices on how to install nodes, on how to run nodes, on how to improve nodes in these environments. So you will basically get some recipes, including command lines for the nodes client, for fixed packs, for language packs, and stuff like that. And at the end, we're going to run through a quick summary on what we have learned. So we are going to start with what you can expect from that session and what we typically see and do at customers. What we typically see at customers when we have consulting engagements in Panagenda is that we are meeting administrators that actually don't really have the time to troubleshoot their environment in regards to the IBM Notes client in most of the cases. And that is not actually blaming these administrators for what they're doing or how they're doing it, but that is simply because today they have mostly way too many responsibilities for other IT systems as well as steadily increasing complexity of their IT systems, so they don't really have the time to focus on the very depths of every of these systems, and that might result in some missing, even unknown knowledge, and even don't knowing about the sources where they can get all these knowledges, and there might even be wrong or missing tooling to solve their problems, to fix their problems and their issues. And while many administrators agree to set up their IT systems when they get the order to do so, in many cases, they just have rarely the time to adequately maintain them after they have been installed. That is what we usually face at customers from, just the human perspective. From a technical perspective, and that is something we will be focusing on very much in this webinar, is we see IBM Notes installations in these virtual environments I was speaking about that are working somehow. And that means in many scenarios, when we come to the customer, these Notes clients are running their data directories on network drives I'm just getting the information that I might not be in presentation mode, but actually I think I'm showing my screen, so let me check if I'm still doing something wrong here. No, well, actually, let me bring up the chat real quick if I see any problems. Oh, okay, I got it. Presentation mode of PowerPoint. So thank you very much for that. I'm gladly doing that. So obviously the screen cannot be seen very good. So let me fix that and then jump to the right slide here. Okay, thanks for the notice. So from a technical perspective, what we usually see at customers are these aged environments. And the Notes client infrastructure that is installed in this virtual environment mostly has their data folders somewhere on the network drive, which comes with a lot of different drawbacks. First of all, startup times of Notes at customers we see may take up to 60 seconds every time the user starts up Notes. That also results in many cases in hangs and wait times, and even the slightest network interruption or poor network latency will basically cause issues to your user's Notes client experience. That again, and of course, causes high network traffic as Notes is continuously reading, writing data against that network drive, which might be a file server or a network attached storage on the other end. And that is actually what customers are facing when they are using these network attached storages for other purposes as well as simply storing files from a file server perspective. As many of these data folders in the network are actually not really maintained most of the times, you might even face corrupted local databases on these network drives, not to speak of the permanently occupied disk space in the network, which is about 100 and 120 megabytes per user, which you keep all the time and which tends to grow quite large unless you are not focusing on maintaining by means of doing local maintenance on these files. So what we're typically doing at customers is, first of all, we speak with the administrators and we're trying to get their enthusiasm back for IBM Notes, to spend more times on troubleshooting IBM Notes in the very depths, deep dive into the background technology of Notes, which actually in most of the cases is even fun to do, to find out what the root causes of their issues are rather than just fixing symptoms. On top of that, we are really emphasizing that most of the customers, and actually basically all of the customers, should switch to local multi-user installations, which again in that case local means on that virtual server environment, frequently maintaining their IBM Notes data directories on these servers, so get rid of all these network drive attached data folders, which in turn relieves their network, that relieves their file servers by space, by network traffic, and such. So one of the next topics, we're ending up with saying all of this in basically every case, is asking the question, to roam or not to roam? Given these previous reasons we've just spoke about, you are facing the following challenges, or at least you will have to follow the following logical questions. So how can you have these IBM Notes data folders being maintained locally on all of these servers? So when you think about every customer has a couple of hundred users, maybe even 1,000 users, these data folders per user cannot be simply kept on every single server in the farm. And of course you end up with not only one server in your Citrix or terminal server farm, but usually you have a couple of those. So let's think about having at least 10 servers in the farm, and potentially a user could log on to every single of these 10 servers at some point in time. You just can't keep data folders for every single user on all of these 10 servers. In the end, you would end up in lots of traffic on the servers and lots of data storage being occupied. That is something you don't want to have. So how do you get the most recent notes configuration of your users to that server where the user logs on? And how do you make sure that the disk space after the user logs off from these servers is cleaned up? So you regain the disk space that was occupied by all the users on that server using a notes session. And then again, how do you avoid that you have to transfer whole data directories, including all of these databases you know that are making up a notes client, which is names NSF, desktop NDK, bookmark NSF, and then there's a cache NDK, and all these additional files. Actually, to get a notes client up and running, you simply don't need to transfer all of these files. By means of, you don't have to transfer a whole notes data directory every time a user logs on, so the user can start working with notes. And the answer to all of that, indeed, is roaming. So to use the IBM standard way, the IBM recommended way, and the way the IBM support would like to see when you open an issue at IBM is actually a local multi-user install, even in these virtual environments. And there is no way around that other than using roaming. When a user logs on, the latest configuration that user was storing when they last shut down their notes clients needs to come back to that server. And the question is how you can achieve that sort of roaming. And there are actually several different procedures to do that. There is domino roaming, which comes with IBM Notes and Domino. There is third-party roaming. In that session, we are quickly mentioning the panagenda Marble client with the roaming module, which is able to do all these things. And then again, you could have your custom-built solution, which is simply, done by login scripts that are grabbing some files from a location and pushing these files to the destination. Having a look at this chart might open the eyes of some administrators in these areas. So when we're having a look at the very top left corner, at some point in time you log on to that virtual session. And already with the logon to that virtual session, you might have the possibility to roam data at this point. That will definitely not be the built-in IBM Notes Domino roaming solution, but that could be third-party solutions or logon scripts that are grabbing data at this point and copying the data over to the virtual environment. After a user has logged on to a virtual session, the user usually starts notes. When the notes client is started at this point, you could also do the roaming part. In that case, for instance, the panagenda Marble client would kick in with the roaming module. It's an extension manager. It kicks in when you start notes. It will grab some data from, for instance, a network drive location and will pull the data over into a newly created local data directory of that notes client. And you log on to notes, and between the login procedure and when the notes client is finally up and running so you can start working with it, you could also have the roaming point. That is, for instance, when IBM roaming would kick in, which is based on replication. So you need a logged on context in the notes client, so the notes client is able to replicate your custom and your personal data from either a Domino server or from a file share locally into the data directory of that virtual environment. Then you continue working with notes, and at some point in time you're going to shut down notes. And at that point you need to think of how to back up your data. So for instance, when the notes client is being shut down, a solution could kick in. Again, that could be an extension manager, so that could be a third-party solution like panagenda Marble client, which is backing up the data at this point and is writing it back to some location, which I guess in most of the cases will be, again, a Domino server or a network drive. Or you might be copying the data you want to back up when you log off from that virtual session. That again would be some third-party solution and custom scripting, for instance, a log off script. And after you have logged off from that virtual session, most of the customers are running some cleanup. That might be scripting that is running frequently on the virtual environment servers that is cleaning up the IBM Notes data folders of the user, as they don't need to be kept on these servers after you have written the backup set to some location in the network. So let's speak about some best practices. The best practices will be about, as you might remember, the session title is about the Notes client as well as the IBM Client Application Access, which was formerly known as the IBM Notes Browser Plugin, which at the moment exists in the version 1001 interim fix 1. And the best practices will be, or will include, our recommendation that in general you really don't need to change the MSI packages from IBM. I mean, in some of the cases you might have the necessity to add something to the kit with the tools IBM is providing, but in general what we recommend is install the Notes client or the browser plugin and then set anything else on top with additional installations. That might be fix packs, that might be language packs, the same time embedded client, the IBM connections plugins, and stuff like that. And additionally, we definitely recommend, if you don't have a proper reason to change that because of some requirements in your policies of your company, just run with the default paths IBM is actually recommending. So this is an example for command lines you will see all over this presentation, and actually in this presentation we will certainly not have the time to focus on every single slide with all the command lines. That would actually be rather boring, but as you will get this webinar as a download, and of course you can also access these slides, for instance on SlideShare, you can use the slides to review the installation command lines for all these several installation packages as Notes, Client Access, Fix Packs, etc., etc. A quick note, which you might notice at the lower right corner on many of these slides. IBM actually has not come up with an own icon for the Client Application Access / browser plugin, so that is simply something we invented ourselves for this presentation. It was done by my dear colleague Christoph Adler, who simply was using the Notes icon plus the iNotes icon, setting both of these on top. So you will notice in the lower right corner every time either the things that you see on the slides apply to both the Client Application Access / browser plugin and the Notes client, or just either one of them. So let's talk about best practices, which are very important when it comes to installing Notes in one of these virtual environments. So let's talk about some background technologies. First of all, when you install Notes, you end up with what we call, or what IBM of course calls, a shared data directory. So compared to a single user installation mode, IBM puts all these templates out of which the databases for Notes are created in a shared directory. So you will only have one central point where the templates will be residing. We'll see later in that presentation where that will be, but in general there is a point on the disk where these templates are kept. It's called the shared data directory. These templates today still have mostly an on-disk structure which is very, very outdated. That is actually an ODS that is coming back from the days of Notes 4. But first of all, let's quickly talk about what ODS is actually all about. So every Notes client version has its own native on-disk structure. Speaking of Notes 4, we had ODS 20. Speaking of Notes 901 today, we have ODS 52. The next slide will give you a bit more insight about that. What you need to know is, we know that all Notes clients are capable of dealing with older ODS databases as well as templates. So if you try to open an ODS 20, which was from Notes 4, database in your Notes 901 client, you end up with no issues. That works just fine. However, the thing you need to know is that Notes is internally converting this to its own native ODS, which in 901 is 52. So let's focus on that slide real quick. This is a list of all the different Notes ODSs that were existing in the past. You can check out which ODS the database is on by bringing up the properties of the application or of the template and check the info tab about the ODS version. So the thing you need to know about how Notes is doing that when, for instance, you open an ODS 20 database with the Notes 901 client, it is starting to convert this database internally to its own native on-disk structure, and it is doing that on every single layer that is in between. And it has to do that every single time you open this database, as it is not permanently converted unless you would compact that database with specific parameters like -ODS. So if you open an ODS 20 database, Notes will internally convert it first from 20 to 41, 43, 48, 51, and then ends up in 52. And if you think of how that could impact the I/O operations on the disk every time you do that with the Notes client on a specific database, and you would think of, let's say, 25 users, maybe even 30 users per server are doing that, that is actually rather a large impact onto the I/O of the hard disk. So a good best practice is, and that's general, that's actually not even just for virtual environments, that's also for every normal Notes client that is running on a physical machine. You should maintain the local files you have and upgrade them always to the latest ODS that is native to the Notes client version you're using. Actually, the difference between an ODS 43, which was back in the Note 6 and 7 days, compared to 52, produces up to 80% less file I/O, and at least 50% in average, which is quite a bit. So just relieve your disks from I/O operations to do that. And what we are doing in a virtual environment is actually grabbing the templates that are in the shared data directory and are upgrading them to the latest ODS, which is native to the version of Notes you're installing. And if this is 901, just add the create R9 databases equals 1 parameter to the shared Notes INI, because that is enabling Notes 901 to use its native ODS 52. If you don't do that, still 901 will even use ODS 43, which was back from the Notes 6 and 7 days. So this is a best practice on how to do this. And as the Notes client is touching these templates quite often, especially when you are wiping the whole data folder of a user every time the user logged off, all these databases need to be newly created from scratch, so the templates will be touched by the Notes client and first need to be converted to the native ODS, which takes quite a while. Next best practice is about the Notes INI. We're speaking of the so-called shared Notes INI, which is used when a Notes user is starting up Notes for the very first, which we call the initial time. And that actually happens basically every time a user logs onto that virtual environment, as long as you're wiping that user's data folder every time the user logs off to free up the disk space. So you will have an initial start every time, and you just should make sure that this start is unattended for that user. And here the shared Notes INI can help. We're speaking of where this file is located. It is basically used as a template Notes INI when you start Notes initially. So the client grabs this INI, grabs the content, and is transferring that content over to the personal Notes INI file that is created in the user's personal IBM Notes data folder. The following slides are about some parameters we would recommend to put into the Notes INI. We have some notes written to some of these parameters for a certain reason. For instance, you will recognize that the port configuration for the TCP/IP port is missing an extension, which for instance would either compress or encrypt the traffic over this port. In a virtual environment, it is highly recommended, for instance, to not turn on compression as compression usually adds up to 5% of CPU overhead for every single client. So when you would calculate with 60 concurrent sessions on a server in the virtual server farm, you would end up in needing at least 3 dedicated CPUs just taking care of the nodes port compression. Then again, you might want to disable the client record, which is having the nodes client reporting back to the domino directory and telling the domino directory in the person document of the user which nodes version and which host name that client was started on. That is actually something you probably don't want to know about your virtual environments, as this is a central, or these are centrally managed environments where you can definitely make sure which exact nodes version and fixed pack version, etc. you are using. And additionally, the name of the host, which in that case would not be a client host name but a server host name, is not probably something you want to see. So you can simply turn that off and avoid the nodes client reporting that information back into the domino directory. Then again, of course, please make sure that the latest ODS version of the nodes client version you are using can be used by putting, for instance, create R9 databases equals 1 into the shared nodes INI to be all set to have every newly created database being created with ODS 52, for instance. Also, something you might not want to have is logging on the nodes client side. So you know every nodes client has a local log NSF and it is logging some things into that file, but actually in a Citrix environment or in a terminal server, basically in a virtual environment, you probably don't want to have that, as in many cases you're simply not having a look into such a log NSF from a virtual node session. So if you turn that off, that is causing some relief on the nodes client side. And if you may wonder why there is still a log line, that log line is missing a very important value, which is the name of the log file. So usually you have log.nsf in front of the 107.40,000 here, which would tell the nodes client in which file should be logged. So if you take that file out, the nodes client has no clue into which database it should log, and it will simply stop doing that. Another thing you probably want to have, as you don't want your users to run into the nodes setup configuration wizard when they log on to their virtual session to configure their nodes client, is an unattended setup. And that is all about what we call, and what IBM calls, the config file. First of all, there's another slide giving you all these just mentioned parameters for copy and paste reasons. And please never forget the blank line at the end of a nodes INI file. That goes for the shared nodes INI as well. Otherwise, you will face the issue that at least one of these parameters cannot be read properly. So the config file I was talking of is a possibility for a nodes client setup to happen unattended. That means the user is starting nodes. The user does not have to go through the setup configuration wizard where he needs to put in a domino server name, selecting an ID file, and then thinking about port configurations and what additional services should be activated in the nodes client. But you can create what is commonly referred to as a config.txt or a setup.txt, which you can reference with a config file equals parameter in the shared nodes INI. And the content of this config file will be used to set up that client unattended. So the experience you want your users to have is simply the user starts nodes, and the only thing, and the thing that he is faced with at least, is just the login dialog. And if on top of that you might be using some single sign-on solution, which could be the old SSO service, that could be NSL, that could be the new nodes federated login / SAML, doesn't matter. But at the only thing and the least thing the user should see is the password dialog prompt where they can put in their password, press enter, and then start nodes. The link in that slide is actually referring to a very good tech note from IBM where a config file and the contents are explained. That's something we simply don't have the time for to run through in this webinar. Then again, let's not forget about the local maintenance I was mentioning earlier. Administrators are usually taking quite some time to take care of their server-side databases. There you have program documents in your Domino directory taking care of maintaining all the databases by means of compacting them to get rid of white space, to get rid of corruption, and fix view indices, and all of these things. But the local client side is usually not maintained in the same way. And then, quite frankly, it is also pretty hard to do that, as although the Notes client gives you the ability to do that with having all these local tasks available, like the ncompact axis or the nfixup axis as well, updall, and all of these tasks, you know, from the server side do exist on the client as well, but calling them is quite a challenge. You can use third-party solutions for that, or you would simply need own custom scripting to call all of these things. But it is highly recommended to at least have a local maintenance on these 4 databases you see here. And then again, you see there's also the log NSF listed, which we previously didn't really recommend to do so. But in case you have the log NSF, that is why it's on that list. Please think about maintaining that database as well, as there is a lot of writing happening into that database, which is in many cases also growing it. So compacting it from time to time is a necessary task. Now we're looking into something we will see in a short live demo in a couple of minutes. We're speaking about the so-called share classes, and that is actually only of interest when we are speaking of the Notes client with the Eclipse framework. So if you would still be thinking of using the basic version of Notes client in your virtual environment, these slides are actually not to take care about, but as long as you're using the Eclipse framework, that might be of very interest. The share classes file is basically a simply weird named file. You see that up here in brackets. It is called xpd-plat, and it has some underscores, and it usually ends with an underscore G11. It has a size of precisely 64 meg, and it is residing in every single data directory of a Notes client in the workspace config org Eclipse OSGI folder. This file can actually be shared across all Notes sessions on a virtual environment server. And that simply means if you would even calculate with only 15 concurrent user sessions on a virtual environment server, you already end up with 900 meg of disk space. You can simply save by taking that file and outsourcing it to a central location where all the Notes client can use it. How you do that is described in these few steps here. So you simply need to go into the JVM properties file, which is located at some point in the program directory of the Notes client, and then change a line to point to a static location on that virtual server. And as of then, the Notes clients will be using this file from the central location. And that on top has another advantage, because every time you are creating a new data folder with an initial start of the Notes client, the Notes client does not have to create this 64 megabyte file, and that even speeds up the Notes client start. But regarding the Notes client start, we even have something better in petto, which we will be talking of in a few minutes. Before we come to speeding up a Notes client initial start, I want to quickly talk about the JVM memory allocation. That is something quite well known in the meantime. So over the last years, there were quite a few articles and tech notes from IBM and also from the community bloggers on the internet speaking about that, and it is still highly recommended. So locate the JVM properties file, which you just have been introduced to when it comes to the shared classes file, and you might want to play around with the upper and lower memory allocation restrictions in that file. And the recommendations on that slide should be actually quite common at the moment for the hardware specifications we have out there. So when you recognize that the default of the upper memory allocation level might still be around 256 or even 512 meg, you might want to consider increasing it to 1 gig In the end, please always make sure that you're not going over that 1 gigabyte, and make sure that the lower level of that memory allocation is only or always be 1/4 of whatever you have changed the upper level to. So when we talk about 1 gig upper level, you simply have to think about 256 megabytes on the lower level. So this is actually kind of the highlight in this webinar, as it will also result in a live demonstration on my virtual machine here. What we recognize with initial starts in customer environments is simply an initial start of nodes usually takes up to 23 seconds. I guess in many environments that are still related on physical disks rather than flash drives and SSD drives, a nodes client start might even take longer, as long as we're speaking about an initial start. In Panagenda, we have found a way of how we can decrease the start times by up to 50, 65, or maybe even 70% by building something we call a prepared workspace folder. So we're basically again talking about the Eclipse version of the Nodes client, and that is as follows. So first of all, let's talk about what a usual workspace directory of the Nodes client with the Eclipse framework consists of. When you start your Nodes client for the very first time and you would right-click on your workspace folder, checking the properties, you end up with over 200 files, 150 folders, and usually with at least 85 megs. And that is because the 64 megabyte share classes file I was talking about previously is still in this org Eclipse OSGI folder. So first of all, let's get rid of that file, and we did that in the earlier best practice. But then again, there's lots of space for improvement. So what we do is the following. You start a Nodes client, for instance, just with an admin ID, and leave that Nodes client untouched for 1 or 2 minutes. And that is because the Nodes client will be creating files in the background while the Nodes client is running. So give that Nodes client some time to build up the workspace directory, and then simply shut down Nodes again. And we recommend to do that at least one more time, as Nodes will be adding some more files with the second start. After you did that, you will have to take that created workspace directory, and we will be using this workspace directory to create some sort of template workspace for every Nodes client that will be started on that virtual server, to keep that Nodes client from having to do that from scratch every single time you start Nodes initially. And for that, we are using a technology IBM Notes is providing by default. So what you're about to see is actually not related to any third-party solution. You can do that without any additional software. In a multi-user environment of Nodes, you will see what we have called the shared data directory, where all the central templates of the multi-user installations are residing. And usually, if you keep the standard of IBM, you will find that in the program data directory in an IBM Notes data subfolder. There you will have a shared folder containing all the templates, and there you will also have the shared Notes INI file, or the stub INI file, as some may refer to it. If you create on the same level a common subfolder, which is not existing by default, so if you simply create that by yourself, and you would put anything into that folder, that might be files, that might be another subfolder, like we will do this with the workspace folder, IBM Notes is doing the following. It will take the files and whatever is in that folder, and we will copy it over to the personal data directory of that user who is starting Nodes at this point in time. There is not really intelligence behind that. What IBM is doing, it is simply comparing whether the content of this directory, of this common folder, is already present in the personal data directory of that Nodes client. So if you put a file into that which is called abc.txt, it will simply check for the existence of abc.txt in the data directory of that user. And if it's not existing, it is copying it over. If it is already existing, it is not overwriting it. It is also not checking timestamps, for instance, to see if the one in the common folder is newer than the one already existing in the personal data folder of the user. So no intelligence behind that, but it is a perfect way to deploy files and folders initially when the Notes client comes up for the very first time. This is how you do it. This is how you prepare that workspace folder you have previously created with that Notes client starts. So take that workspace, move it into another location, go into it, and start deleting the UDM folder, start deleting all the files except the prof2install file from the logs folder, and so on. So the only thing you will be simply doing is deleting some files out of that workspace folder, which would be kind of personal to the configuration of that user you were using to create that workspace folder initially. With that, you have created a template workspace folder. And at this point, let me dive into a live demo real quick. So I'm stepping out of that presentation and I'm going into my virtual machine here, and let me go full screen, so to hopefully get that working from a view perspective for you. And now let's give a demonstration. So what I'm about to do is actually I'm going to stop a Notes client start one time without the prepared workspace directory, and then the second time with the prepared workspace directory to show you the difference. And everybody in this presentation, in this webinar, is of course welcome to now pull out their stopwatches to stop together with me, so you don't have to rely on the times I'm going to tell you. Although I can promise you that you will, even without stopping the time, you will basically feel the difference between a start with a prepared workspace folder and without. So first of all, let's have a look at this client installation here. And what I have here is a standard Notes client multi-user install with the Notes 901 client and some fixpack. So I would usually end up with an IBM data directory in my local app data directory of that client, which in my case is C users, that's my username, app data local, and you see right now there is no IBM folder present, which means this will be an initial roaming start. So what I'm about to do is I'm starting Notes, and I will be start with stopping the time after I've put in my password and I'm pressing enter. So everybody who wants to do that stop together with me, I'm counting down from 3 now, and I will stop measuring the time when the Notes client with the user interface is up and running, and I will see my workspace with the icons and above the toolbar, and I will also say stop when I'm stopping to measure the time. So I'm counting down 3, 2, 1, go. The time is running now, and this is a start without the prepared workspace folder in the so-called common directory, and that usually ends up in a time about 20 seconds, maybe 21, 23, as the Notes client has to create that whole workspace folder except stop right here. So I'm sorry for interrupting. So the start in that case, in my stopwatch, was about 23 seconds. If somebody has measured the time together with me, you probably will face some lag due to this webinar, to this remote presentation, but that start was between 22 and 25 seconds. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm shutting down Notes. This time, I'm going to prepare something different. First of all, let's get rid of the IBM Notes data folder completely, so my next start will also be an initial start where the Notes client has to create the whole data folder from scratch. But this time I'm also going into the shared data directory, which we were previously talking about, and you see there's this common folder I've already created, but right now it is empty. I will move the prepared workspace template folder into this common folder to have the Notes client copying it over when I'm starting the Notes client for the very first time. But first of all, let's check the properties real quick. So you see this workspace folder right now has about, let's round that up, 7 megabytes containing almost 200 files and 130 folders. And that is what we will keep the Notes client from creating from scratch, because we are providing it as a template. So when I'm next starting up Notes, which I'm about to do right now, I'm waiting for the logon screen to appear, quickly bringing up the Windows Explorer window in the background. You see there is my new IBM Notes data directory, and if I'm having a look into it, there is already the workspace folder, which right now should have the exact same properties, even more, as Notes has created some files in there already even before I've logged in, but it is already there and it will spare a lot of time with the next Note start. So let's type in the password again, and I'm again counting down, and this time I can promise I will not have the time to even explain a lot of things, which is not necessary anyway, because we know what will be going on, because that Notes client will be up and running very fast, although it is an initial start. So I'm counting down now, 3, 2, 1, go. And this time I'm stopping again, stop. And I don't know what your stopwatches are telling, but this start was actually between 5 and 6 seconds on my stopwatch. To be precise, it was 5.7 in my case. So this is how you can actively, with very, very less effort or little effort, decrease the Notes client start time in your virtual environment. So again, please think of the following scenario. A user logs on, roaming kicks in, pulls the data for that user, does the personal configuration to that virtual environment server. You might be using that workspace improvement, which plays a very, very positive role into the startup time of that Notes client, and the user will experience a Notes client configuration that is his or her personal configuration plus startup times that might be in the area of way than less or less than 10 seconds. So compared to whatever we have seen at other customers in the past, that is a speed up, an increase, or let's say a decrease of the Notes startup time by actually over 70%. The following slides are about all the recipes I was talking about previously. So let me give you some examples about the step-by-step recipes of the Notes installation packages, the fixed pack installations, multi-language packs, etc. The list you see on the screen right now is all about the packages we will be focusing on. So you will see example install command lines for the Notes 901 client, for the multi-language packs, also with different options. So for instance, this first multi-language pack will only add the German and the French language, although it contains much more languages. For the second one, we will be adding every language that is contained in that package, but we will set the Danish language to be the default one. So when the user starts up that Notes client, also the local databases will automatically be getting the Danish language templates. So for the other ones, we'll be adding, again, all the languages. We have an installation command line for same time embedded 901 with a specific release, just to show you how you would usually install that. And also what you see here is a subsequent order on how we recommend to install the Notes packages. So always start with the Notes client, obviously, and then add the language packages and the same time embedded client, the connections plugins, and then at the very end, add the fixed packs. Right now we have the fixed pack 5 interim fix 3 available for the Notes 901 client. So this is again something that does not really make sense to go through in that webinar. That is something that comes in handy when you later on download the presentation to have a look at all the command lines. You can copy and paste them. You can try them out. This is a recommendation on which topics from this webinar you should apply to Notes 901 in that case. So again, think about the ODS of the templates, think about the config file and the shared Notes INI to bring up your clients unattended, think about of outsourcing the shared classes file and the workspace improvement, and also increase the memory allocation for the Java virtual machine of the Notes client. And when it comes to the browser plugin, which today is called Client Application Access, you will also get some best practices about how to install the packages from the Client Application Access right now, and that was just recently released. I think that was at the end of February 2016, IBM released the interim fix 1 for the Client Application Access 1001. And these are the command lines on how to install these things. And then again, of course, as the Client Application Access / browser plugin does not include anything like an Eclipse framework, it does not make sense to focus on the workspace improvement or the Java shared classes file. So this is a list of the things you should still focus on when it comes to deploying Client Application Access. You still should take care of the ODS of the templates in the shared data directory, as well as the Notes INI file. And also you can use a config file to bring up the browser plugin without any user intervention. So as a summary of that webinar, let me again emphasize, we highly recommend, and actually we are not only recommending this to do that in a virtual environment, but in a virtual environment it makes the most sense to have local multi-user installations, because that makes you ready for roaming, and it doesn't matter which type of roaming you're using. Doesn't matter if it's the IBM roaming method or if it's any third-party or custom scripting roaming solution you might have built on your own. Multi-user installations are the way to go, and actually you still have to expect IBM to remove the single-user installation mode from the Notes client with a next version that might be coming out. IBM actually already announced that for Notes 901, but they didn't make it. So in 901 you still have the possibility of installing the Notes client only as a single user, but IBM wanted to get rid of this for quite a while, so you always have to expect it. And the best thing you can do is being prepared for that. So with the next Notes client upgrade project you might be having, think of going local multi-user install, so for every user having their own personal data folder, which makes roaming scenarios way easier compared to if you would need to overwrite the configuration of a previous user every time you roam onto a client or into a virtual session. The users will benefit from that. Having everything local will make Notes start faster. You will face less database corruption as long as you take care of local maintenance. And in the virtual environment, as you are wiping the data folder every time a user logs off to free the disk space, and you will be recreating the data directories every time that the user logs on, you will probably not face any database corruption in the future any longer. And of course you will have improved stability as you are not having that network component in between where the slightest network interruption will basically cause your Notes client to stop. You will free your storage on the network side. You will gain network quality back because Notes is not continuously firing over the network against network attached storages or file servers. You will have less support incidents and of course in the end more satisfied end users. And if you have the time to do that, we always want to emphasize it makes sense to spend more time on maintaining your IBM Notes virtual infrastructure as well as your usual IBM infrastructure on physical clients as well. If you want to have details about how to manage Notes clients in virtual environments as well as on physical clients, please feel free to talk to Panagenda. This is my email address. It's daniel.reimann@panagenda.com. I'm open to every question. I would love to show you how to manage Notes clients. You know we have the panagenda Marble Client solution that also comes with the roaming module, which is effectively roaming your Notes client configurations of users with a little footprint, which usually does not grow bigger than 5 megabytes per user, as we are using a technology which is not even roaming native databases as the desktop NDK or the bookmark NSF, but we are rather exporting the content into XML. We are compressing it into a zip file. So with a formally desktop NDK and a bookmark NSF, which have a size of maybe up to 100 meg, we're able to decrease the size of the content of these two files down to not even 500 kilobytes. And if you compress that into a zip file, you end up with probably less than 100 kilobytes. This is the technology we are offering. If you're interested, feel free to contact Panagenda. Feel free to contact me at any time. At this point in time, I want to thank you very much for your attention. Karen, I'm virtually looking into your direction. I don't know if we maybe want to open the microphones from our attendees for some questions. If not, just feel free to download that webinar. It has been recorded, and have a very, very great day. Thank you very much.